The Jedi and the Sith are the two most famous Force religions in the galaxy. They are far from the only ones. Across the full span of Legends continuity, dozens of groups studied the Force and came to wildly different conclusions about its nature, its purpose, and the right way to use its power. Some built monastic orders and wrote codes of conduct, others forged armor and trained for war. A few call the Force by different names, practicing it as magic, as prophecy, as a pure illusion. And at least one group looked at the divide between light and dark and decided the whole framework was wrong. Some of these traditions existed for 10,000 years. Others burned out in a single generation. More than a few went to war with the Jedi after their doctrines crossed lines the Order refused to tolerate. And a surprising number survived long enough to bump into Luke Skywalker. Most of them have been forgotten, from the beings who moved stars before anyone had a word for the Force, to the cults that crawled out of the Empire's ashes. The history of Force religion is longer, stranger, and bloodier than the Jedi and Sith rivalry alone accounts for. And long before any Jedi or Sith drew a lightsaber, other civilizations had already touched the Force and remade the galaxy around it. Chapter 1. Before the Temples. The Force predates every temple, code, or creed in galactic history. It threaded through every living thing and every dead rock in the galaxy. Stars burned with its energy, gravity warped around its currents. Before the civilization rose, nobody worshipped the Force, because nobody had given it a name. The first beings who may have understood the Force didn't leave prayers behind, they left planets. In the Essential Atlas and the Dawn of the Jedi comics, the oldest known civilization in the galaxy was a group called the Celestials, sometimes referred to as the Architects. They existed deep in the pre-Republic era, older than any other recorded civilization, but no source pins down exactly when. It has never been pinned down how long they existed, and nothing they left behind offers an answer. The Celestials are known almost through the things that they left behind, and those things are so large that later civilizations had trouble believing any species could have built them. Their most staggering creation was Centerpoint Station, a space station parked between the twin worlds of Talos and Tralis in the Corellian system that could move planets. The Celestials used it to drag entire worlds into orbit around the star Corel, assembling the 5-planet Corellian system like pieces on a game board. The Maw, a cluster of black holes near Kessel, may also be their work, an astronomical structure too perfectly arranged to be natural. In a different part of the galaxy, the remains of celestial constructions dot hyperspace lanes and dead star systems like road markers left by a traveler who never came back. The Celestials didn't build lightsabers. They didn't write codes or take apprentices. Whether they used the Force, worshipped it, or were part of it remains an open question. But they are the earliest evidence that beings with a connection to the Force could alter the galaxy on a structural level. And then, at some point, they vanished, leaving no record of war, plague, or decline. They left their constructions behind and disappeared from history, and no civilization since has been able to explain where they went. Several species rose in the Celestials' wake. Two of them interacted with the Force in ways that changed everything that came after, and their legacies reveal two opposite responses to discovering the Force. The first answer came from the Qua. In the Dawn of the Jedi comics and in Mother Talzin's writings collected in the Book of Sith, the Qua are described as a Force-sensitive reptilian species who once occupied multiple worlds including Dathomir and Tython. These Celestials had used the Force to build on a cosmic scale. The Qua, on the other hand, used it to travel. Their greatest achievement was the Infinity Gate, a network of portals that allowed instant transportation between star systems. Step through one gate and step out of another, light years away, in the span of a heartbeat. Talzin wrote that the Qua built these gates for interstellar travel, but their machines created unnatural voids and wounded the worlds they connected. The Qua treated the Force as a tool for exploration and engineering, using it to transport objects and beings across impossible distances. They didn't worship it. They used it the way a shipwright uses a hyperdrive, as a means to an end. However, the Qua's reach attracted attention they couldn't handle. On Dathomir, Talzin writes that the planet's spirits summoned the Rakata Empire to demolish the Qua. Regardless of whether Talzin's spirit-based explanation reflects actual events or a mythologized account of a territorial war between two Force-sensitive empires, the outcome was the same. The Kwa were broken. On Dathomir, they devolved over generations into the Kui, a primitive herd animal with no memory of its ancestors' civilization. On Tython, the Kwa died out after destroying the planet's Infinity Gate, possibly to keep it from falling into enemy hands. A species that at one step between stars was reduced to grazing animals on one world and bones on another. Before the Kwa vanished, they may have played a role in seeding the galaxy's most important religious tradition. A holocron, a crystalline device that stored the teachings and personality of its creator, was found on Tython. Built by the Kwa, it predates the arrival of the first pilgrims. Its gatekeeper, a Kwa named Anang, carried knowledge of a group of ancient vessels, towering pyramids that sat dormant on worlds across the galaxy, waiting. No one else possessed any record of them. Whether the Kwa actually designed them or inherited knowledge of ships created by an even older civilization remains unresolved. Either way, the Kwa understood the ship's purpose before anyone else did, and that knowledge would prove critical when the time came. The Kwa used the Force to explore. The second civilization used it to conquer, and the difference between those two choices shaped the galaxy for 30,000 years. The Rakata were a tall amphibian species with elongated skulls and gray skin. They built the Infinite Empire roughly 36,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, and they fueled it with the dark side of the Force. In the Knights of the Old Republic video game, the Rakata discovered something no species before them had attempted. The Force could power technology. It could amplify a warrior's reflexes or sharpen a seer's visions, but the Rakata went further. They used it to run machines. Hyperdrives, weapons, and factory stations all drew energy from the same corrupted well, and the Rakata built the Starforge, a factory station so large and so productive that every other piece of Rakatan technology depended on it. It was an automated factory station that orbited a star and fed directly on its energy. Its assembly lines, guided by the Force, produced warships, droids, and weapons without a single living worker on its production floors. It also fed on the dark side. The more dark side energy its operators poured into the station, the faster and more efficiently it produced. But the exchange went both ways. Over time, the station consumed its operators as thoroughly as it consumed raw materials, pulling them deeper into aggression and cruelty with every production cycle. The Starforge didn't just build weapons, it turned the people who ran it into weapons too. At the Infinite Empire's peak, the Rakata controlled around 5,000 worlds and enslaved entire species to build and service their infrastructure. Humans, Duros, Selkath, and many others served as laborers and test subjects. On conquered worlds, entire populations were worked through generations of Force construction, building Rakatan temples, factories, and hyperspace beacons. The Rakata didn't worship the Force, they consumed it, and their grip on the galaxy lasted for thousands of years. Then, in a span of months, the entire empire fell. A plague struck. It targeted the Rakata specifically and severed their connection to the Force. Some sources speculate that the slave species engineered the plague as a biological weapon. Others treat it as a natural consequence of the Rakata's deep connection to the dark side, a kind of spiritual burnout that infected their entire kind. The cause has never been settled, but the result was immediate. Without the Force, Rakatan technology stopped working, hyperdrives went dead, weapons failed, and communication between Rakatan worlds broke down within months. Each planetary garrison found itself isolated, cut off from orders, reinforcements, and supplies. And the slave species saw the opening. Revolts broke out across the Empire. On world after world, slaves turned on their weakened masters, seizing weapons, ships, and territory. The Rakata, who had spent millennia as the galaxy's unchallenged rulers, suddenly couldn't move between their own star systems or coordinate a response. By roughly 25,200 BBY, the Infinite Empire had splintered into warring factions and faded from galactic history. The Rakata retreated to their home world of Lihan, where they devolved into a tribal society with no memory of their former reach. Thousands of years later, a Jedi turned Sith named Revan would rediscover the Starforge and nearly use it to conquer the Republic all over again, proving that the Rakata's most dangerous legacy was the one they had left behind in orbit. one truth from the Rakata's reign would echo through every era of Force history. The Force could be industrialized, turned into fuel for conquest. Every Sith Lord who later built a superweapon was walking in the Rakata's footsteps, whether they knew it or not. But the Rakata's plague and collapse were still thousands of years in the future. While the Infinite Empire was still at its peak, still conquering worlds and enslaving species, the pyramid ship stirred. Something was calling. In the year 36,453 BBY, 8 of the ancient vessels had been sitting on 8 different worlds for centuries. In some cases, millennia, dormant, and silent. On the frozen planet Ando Prime, in the Endobi Mountains, a group of monks called the Order of Dai Bendu had spent 1,000 years in the shadow of one of them. The Dai Bendu were Talid, a stocky, 4-armed mammalian species native to the planet, and they had sensed through the Force that the strange relic contained secrets waiting to be revealed. They named the ship Thoyor, and for 10 centuries they meditated beside it and waited. When the Thoyor finally opened and called to them through the Force, the Dai Bendu were the first aboard. 7 other Thoyor did the same on 7 other worlds, each one reaching out to the Force-sensitive beings who lived nearby. On the jungle world of Kashyyyk, Wookiees, tall, fur-covered humanoids who lived among the branches of towering Roshir trees, had guarded a Thoyor for generations. They laid down their crystal-studded clubs and walked inside. Beneath the surface of Manan, an ocean world, Selkath scholars, an aquatic species who rarely ventured above the waves, abandoned their undersea research to board a ship that had sat submerged for millennia. Across Ryloth, a cave-riddled world, Twi'leks, humanoids recognizable by the twin-head tails called Leku that hung from their skulls, left their underground cities and followed the pull. Deep in the misty valleys of Dathomir, a forested and wild world, shamans and seers located a Thoyor and boarded with their Rancor mounts. Humans, a feline Cathar, the horned Zabrek, and members of at least a dozen other species heard the call and answered it. None of them knew where they were going or who else had answered. They boarded because the Force told them to, and because the ships, after centuries of silence, had finally asked. Once the boarding was complete, all 8 Thoyor jumped to hyperspace and converged on a single destination, Tython, a lush planet deep in the galaxy's core. When they arrived, a 9th Thoyor, the largest, was already waiting, floating above a tall pillar of stone. The 8 ships scattered across Tython's surface, some landing on mountains, one sinking into a deep ocean, others hovering in the sky, and deposited their passengers. A forest storm tore across the planet as they landed. The pilgrims, strangers from a dozen worlds who spoke different languages and followed different customs, had to learn fast. Tython was saturated with the Force in a way no other planet in the galaxy could match, and the planet had rules. When the pilgrims fell out of step, when too many of them leaned towards aggression, or too many retreated into passivity, Tython responded with earthquakes and storms that could kill. Keeping the light and dark in check meant survival on Tython, a matter of life and death rather than religious discipline. The pilgrims looked up at the sky and saw 2 moons. One was bright, and they named it Ashla. The other was dark, and they named it Bogun. Light and dark, visible every night, circling the same world. From the Dai Bendu language, they borrowed 2 words, Je, meaning mystic, and Dai, meaning center. Together, the words became Jedi, the name of their new order. For the first time in galactic history, beings from across the stars organized a shared belief around the Force. The Thoyor became the foundations of 9 temples, each dedicated to a different discipline. Bodhi, the Temple of the Arts, sat on the southern coast. Maharakesh, the Temple of Healing, floated in a deep ocean, wrapped around the Thoyor that had sunk beneath the waves. Shigan Kesh, the Temple of Force Skills, lay a 3 days walk into a silent desert where the sands absorbed all sound. Stavkesh trained warriors in the Ice Giant Range. Akarkesh, perched beneath the largest Thoyor atop the Great Stone Pillar, served as the Temple of Balance, where masters meditated on the relationship between Ashla and Bogun. And Padawan Kesh trained new students in the basics before sending them on the Great Journey, a 2-year pilgrimage across Tython's surface to visit every temple and train in every discipline. As the novel Dawn of the Jedi Into the Void describes, over the following 1,000 years, the Jedi raised cities and families on Tython. Children grew up immersed in the Force from their first breath. Generations passed. The temples expanded their teachings, and the Jedi began mapping the Force's behavior in ways no previous civilization had attempted. They identified currents that responded to motion, fields that shifted with planetary movement, and patterns in the Force that repeated across generations of students. Their rangers patrolled the regions where settlements had grown on Tython, and their scholars debated the relationship between Ashla and Bogun at Akarkesh. And then Tython exposed a cost that no temple could absorb. Not everyone born on Tython could touch the Force. On a world that punished imbalance with lethal storms, that absence was a death sentence. After generations of loss, the Jedi sent every non-Force sensitive Tythan away, scattering them to the moons and the outer worlds of the Tython system. The decision would haunt the Order for millennia. Every Jedi, Sith, heretic, mystic, and armored exile that came after traces back to what happened on Tython when the Thoyor landed. But the Jedi weren't Jedi, not even close. Their founding belief was something no later Jedi would recognize, a doctrine demanding the equal embrace of light and dark on a planet that tore apart anyone who leaned too far in either direction. Chapter 2: Jedi and the First Fractures. The Jedi didn't just teach an equal respect for light and dark. They enforced it through a system of exile and correction that governed every member of the Order from their first day of training. In the Dawn of the Jedi comics and the novel Into the Void, any Jedi who leaned too far towards the light was exiled to the Dark Moon, Bogun. Anyone who fell too deep into aggression or anger was sent to the Bright Moon, Ashla. The exile wasn't permanent, but it served as a correction, a period of isolation designed to pull the individual back towards center. However, the message was clear. On Tython, every Jedi walked the line between Ashla and Bogun, or the Order removed them from the planet until they could. Into the Void captures the core teaching, passed from parent to child across generations. The Force was neither light nor dark, neither master nor slave, but a spectrum between extremes. Temple Master Vordana of Stavkesh taught that sitting between those extremes rather than choosing one would produce a powerful stillness, and that struggling against the Force would only cause the body to rebel. The lesson was practical, not abstract. A Jedi who lost control of their anger risked more than personal corruption. A loss of control could trigger a Force storm that could kill everyone in a 10-kilometer radius. For over 10,000 years, the system worked. The Jedi trained students called Journeyers at 9 temples spread across Tython's continents and oceans. Each temple specialized in a different discipline, and a Journeyer's education was incomplete until they had trained at all of them. The name came from their central rite of passage, the Great Journey, a 2-year pilgrimage that connected all 9 temples. A young Journeyer would leave Padawan Kesh and walk, not fly, not ride, walk, across deserts, through forests, over mountains, and along coastlines, with nothing for company except the Force and whatever traveling partner they had been assigned. One such journey is seen through the eyes of Lenori Brock, a talented Journeyer whose brother Dal had almost no connection to the Force. For Lenori, the journey was a deepening of everything she already felt. Each temple challenged her in a different way, pushing her to develop skills that she hadn't known she needed. For Dal, the journey was 2 years of watching his sister thrive in a world that had no room for him. He couldn't feel the storms coming. He couldn't sense the shifts in Tython's mood. He was walking through a conversation he couldn't hear, surrounded by people for whom the Force was as natural as breathing. The Great Journey was built on a premise that the later Jedi Order would not accept, that contact with the bowgun was necessary, even beneficial. A student who arrived at Stavkesh with a strong command of healing, but weak combat instincts, would be pushed until they found their center. On the other hand, a student who excelled at martial applications, but resisted meditation, would be forced to sit with the silence at Shigan Kesh, buried beneath the silent desert until it stopped feeling like punishment. Either way, the system treated light and dark as complementary muscles. Neglect one, and the other would weaken. Train both, and the whole body grew stronger. The Jedi treated the Force like weather, a power to be read and adapted to, not chosen or controlled. The first 1,000 years after the Thoyor arrival tested every generation. Force storms struck without warning, triggered by shifts in the collective mood of the population that no individual could control alone. Entire settlements were rebuilt after storms flattened them. The Jedi learned to read the planet's moods the way a sailor reads the sea, adjusting their practices community by community, temple by temple. Keeping Ashla and Bowgun in equal measure became a skill, trained and measured beyond a principle spoken at temple gates. However, the system had no answer for people like Lenori Brock's brother, Dal. Children born to Jedi parents who couldn't touch the Force were exiled from Tython, sent to the moons and the other worlds of the Tython system. The Jedi told themselves that the exile was for the children's safety. Tython storms couldn't be reasoned with, and a person who couldn't sense the Force couldn't protect themselves from a planet that punished imbalance with earthquakes. Over the millennia, however, those non-Force sensitive populations built cities, governments, and economies of their own on those worlds, and they remembered who had sent them away. The exile may have started as a safety measure. By the time it had lasted 10,000 years, it looked like a permanent divide. By 25,805 BBY, resentment had reached a breaking point. A Twi'lek ruler named Queen Hadia of the planet Shikakwa turned that resentment into an armed rebellion that became known as the Despot War. The conflict was not about Ashla or Bowgun, light or dark, or any argument about how the Force should be studied. Hadia spent years building a coalition across the Outer Worlds, recruiting criminals and mercenaries alongside legitimate political leaders who saw the Jedi as an occupying elite living in comfort on a paradise planet while everyone else lived under their shadow. She cast the war in terms any non-Force sensitive could understand. The Jedi controlled Tython, Tython controlled the star system, and nobody had voted for any of it. Her armies attacked with conventional weapons and conventional tactics, backed by the sheer weight of numbers and the fury of populations who had been told for millennia that their lack of Force sensitivity made them second-class citizens in their own star system. The Jedi defeated Hadia, and she died during the conflict, but the victory exposed a crack the Order never managed to repair. The Jedi had spent 10,000 years perfecting the inner harmony of individual Force users. They had spent almost no time thinking about the relationship between Force sensitives and the rest of the population. Their philosophy was designed for people who could touch the Force. It had nothing to say to people who couldn't. The Jedi Order would repeat in different forms for the next 25,000 years. Then, a threat arrived from outside the star system. In 25,793 BBY, a Rakatan warship called the Devourer jumped into the Tython system and crashed on the planet's surface. The ship's crew was dead. Its cargo of enslaved Force sensitives was dead. The only survivor was a warrior named Zesh. Zesh was a Force Hound, a living weapon bred and trained by the Infinite Empire to sniff out Force-rich worlds for Rakatan conquest. Force Hounds were taken as infants, stripped of their names and identities, and raised in isolation. Their training was built on pain. They learned to track Force-rich worlds by sensing the energy through their skin, and every failure was punished until the sensation became instinct. Zesh had never been taught that the Force had a light side. He only knew the bowgun, and he carried a Force saber, a weapon similar to a lightsaber, but powered by dark side energy alone. The moment Zesh set foot on Tython, his presence in the Force was so lopsided that the planet reacted. A Force storm erupted, growing stronger the longer the Force Hound remained. Tython had survived 10,000 years of minor imbalances from its own inhabitants. Zesh was an imbalance the planet had never encountered, a being who existed on one side of the Force, with no Ashla to offset the bowgun pouring off of him. 3 young journeyers, Shay Koda, Sekno's Wrath, and Tasha Rio received a shared vision of Zesh through the Force and tracked him into a canyon called the Rift, a ravine saturated with the bowgun's energy and filled with hostile creatures. In the Force Storm arc, the encounter shook each of the 3 in different ways. Koda, a fighter by instinct, was drawn to Zesh's raw strength and later developed a complicated bond with the Force Hound that blurred the line between fascination and something more dangerous. Wrath, competitive and quick-tempered, felt his own anger pulled closer to the surface by proximity to so much aggressive energy. Rio, the most analytical of the 3, turned to research, searching the Jedi archives at the Temple of Kaleth for any records of Zesh's species or the civilization that had trained him. What Rio found in the archives expanded the crisis beyond anything the Order had prepared for. The Kwa holocron, dormant for millennia, identified the skull of a dead crew member from the Devourer as Rakata and warned the Jedi of the Infinite Empire's reach. For the first time, the Order understood that Zesh wasn't a lone wanderer. He was a scout, and the Empire that had sent him controlled hundreds of worlds. Within a year of Zesh's crash, the full Rakatan fleet arrived in the Tython system. In the Force War arc, the Rakata conquered half the star system's colony worlds before the Jedi could mount a full defense. The planets Obri and Maur fell, and in order to fight back, the Jedi made a decision that split their order down the middle. They picked up the Force Sabers. The Force Sabers were dark-side weapons. Every Jedi who carried one felt the bowgun pulling at them, whispering through the hilt, rewarding aggression and punishing hesitation. For a people whose entire discipline depended on walking the line between Ashla and bowgun, the Force Sabers tipped the scales. Rajvari, one of the most respected Jedi Masters, commanded the defense as a general, and his tactical brilliance kept the Order alive through the worst of the fighting. However, the cost was visible in the ranks. Some Jedi leaned further into the bowgun than they ever had, drawing on anger and fear to fuel their combat abilities. And when the fighting stopped, they didn't lean back. The weapons that saved Tython also broke it. The Rakata were driven from the Tython system when Jedi Tasha Rio sacrificed her life to awaken the Thoyor's weapons. Using the Qua Holocron of Anang, Rio entered the lowest level of Anil Kesh and poured her body's energy into the Thoyor, which fired beams of concentrated force energy that destroyed the Rakatan warships in orbit. Rio's body dissolved in the process. She was the youngest of the three journeyers who had first tracked Zesh into the rift, and she was the one who paid the highest price. The Rakata's grip on the Tython system was broken, but the Jedi Order fractured along the very fault line its doctrine was designed to prevent. Two factions emerged. One, the followers of Ashla, believed the Force should serve knowledge, protection, and peace. The other, the followers of Bogun, believed the war had proven the value of aggression and that the old commitment to the middle path was a weakness that the Order could no longer afford. Both sides had fought the Rakata together. Neither side could forgive the other for how they had fought. The Force Wars broke out, a decade-long civil war fought on Tython's surface. The Ashla faction fortified the surviving temples and fought a defensive campaign, relying on conventional weapons and protective force techniques. The Bogun faction struck hard and fast, armed with force sabers and aggressive force abilities honed during the Rakata War. Former training partners faced each other on battlefields where they had once sparred with wooden swords. The fighting wrecked Tython at a pace no conventional war could match. Force storms, which had once been rare corrections triggered by minor imbalances, became constant. Lightning tore through skies that hadn't seen clear weather in years. Earthquakes swallowed entire settlements. Several temples were abandoned as the terrain around them grew too unstable to inhabit, and the infrastructure the Jedi had spent 10,000 years building crumbled in less than a decade. The followers of Ashla won, but the world they won was a ruin. By 25,783 BBY, Tython's biosphere was devastated. Forests burned, coastlines buckled, and entire continents were rendered uninhabitable. Tython, the world that had rewarded its inhabitants for keeping the Force in check, punished them for losing it. Four Jedi Masters, Rajvari, the War General, Garen Jard, a combat instructor, Caleb Bryn, a healer, and Tur Sendin, a temple scholar, led the Ashla faction to victory and founded a new order on the ashes of the old one. They dropped a syllable from the name and called themselves the Jedi Order, and they made a choice that would define every Force tradition that emerged after them. The Jedi committed exclusively to the light side. The founding principle of equal Ashla and Bogun, the idea that had governed the Jedi since the founding, was abandoned. After 10,000 years and a civil war, the survivors decided that the dark side was too dangerous to coexist with. Even the founders couldn't agree on what the new order should look like. Rajvari, the general who had led the defense against the Rakata, broke with the other three founders almost immediately. He seized the temple at Kaleth and gathered followers who believed the Jedi Order's rejection of the bowgun was premature, that the war had proven dark-side weapons could save lives as well as take them. The other three founders put down Rajavari's rebellion, and his founders died defending their position. Rajavari's revolt was the first internal crisis the Jedi Order faced, and it happened before the Order was even a generation old. The pattern it set, gifted Force users questioning the Jedi's boundaries and being crushed for it, would repeat across the Order's entire history. The Jedi who survived abandoned Tython. The planet could no longer support them. They relocated to Ossus in the Outer Rim, joining a galactic republic that had formed among the civilizations that overthrew the Rakata. The Republic was still young and cautious. and it eventually restricted travel to the deep core where Tython sat. Within a few generations, the route back was lost, and most Jedi had never heard the word Jedi. Roughly 1,300 years of relative peace followed. Then, the Order split again. In 24,500 BBY, a Jedi Knight named Zendor approached the High Council on Ossus. Zendor had been born on Kashi, an Outer Rim world whose people studied the Force under a different name. He had been exiled from his home world before its sun went supernova and destroyed the planet, and he had earned his rank in the Jedi Order through dedication and skill. The Jedi vs. Sith reference guide describes Zendor as having spent years studying Force traditions outside what the Jedi taught, including the martial teachings of the followers of Palawa and techniques that the Council had classified as forbidden. His core argument was that the Jedi definition of the Force was too narrow. Other cultures across the galaxy had discovered the Force independently, developed their own techniques, and reached conclusions that the Jedi would not examine. Zendor called the Jedi Order exclusionary and argued that any honest study of the Force required contact with all of its suspects, including the Bogan. He asked for permission to open a new academy where students could explore the full range of Force traditions. The Council turned him down, and their decision left no room for negotiation. They would not permit any sanctioned study of the Bogan under the Jedi banner. From the Council's perspective, the Force Wars had already proven where the Bogan led. But to Zendor's point of view, the leadership was repeating the same error the Jedi had made on Tython, treating one aspect of the Force as dangerous and banning anyone from studying it. The Jedi had exiled the non-Force sensitives, and now the Jedi were doing something similar by deciding which knowledge was acceptable and which was forbidden. Zendor left the Order and founded his own academy on a world called Leto. Arden Lin, a warrior who practiced the ancient martial art of Taraskasi and carried a talisman from the Kashimir dynasty, went with him. At first, only a handful of Jedi followed. Then the numbers grew. Dissenters trickled out of the Order in ones and twos, then in larger groups, drawn by Zendor's argument that the Jedi had no right to dictate which aspects of the Force could be studied. The followers named themselves the Legions of Leto and pledged to defend their right to study the Force without the Council's interference. At the Academy on Leto, the Legionnaires built their own rituals. Initiates forged Force-imbued steel blades in furnace ceremonies inherited from ancient Tythan practices, melding the blade's molecular structure with a crystal's energy until the two became one weapon. They studied the Jar-Kai dual-blade fighting style, renamed Naman after the triumvirate of Kashi gods, and they embraced the Bogan openly, treating emotion, passion, and personal power as legitimate paths to understanding the Force. Whether Zendor genuinely believed the Bogan could be studied safely, or whether he had already been pulled too deep to see the line, nobody knew, but his followers were armed, angry, and growing in number. The Jedi declared war. The conflict, later called the First Great Schism, spread quickly across the Republic. Zendor tried to end the fighting early by leading an attack on Ossus, but the assault failed. The Jedi pushed the Legionnaires back, and over the following months, battles broke out across Republic core worlds: Chandrila, Brental IV, Coruscant, and Metelos. Zendor tried a different tactic between battles. He went to the Republic government and warned them that the Jedi were positioning themselves as the galaxy's protectors while quietly consolidating power. The Republic ignored him and labeled Zendor a warlord. Whatever validity his argument carried was drowned out by the body count the war was producing. On Calamus, a world both sides were fighting to hold, the war ended with a single duel. Jedi Grandmaster Adres Tapina, known by his nickname the Green Blade, cornered Zendor's vanguard and used a Force Meld, a shared psychic link between multiple Jedi, to separate Zendor from the bulk of his army. Isolated, Zendor fought Pina directly. Pina killed him on the battlefield. Arden Lin inherited command of what was left of the Legionnaires. On Leto, the remnants fought a desperate rearguard action, buying enough time for the last survivors to flee outside the Republic's borders. Pina tracked Lin across unknown space to a world called Urkala. In their final confrontation, Lin used the Kashimir talisman Zendor had given her to shatter Pina's blade and drive the shards through his body. As he died, Pina reached into the Force and used a rare technique called Morocro to stop Lin's heart. Lin didn't die. She entered a suspended state that lasted over 24,000 years, until Imperial agents revived her in 4 BBY. A faction within the Jedi questioned the boundaries. The Council would not bend, and the dissenters left. The war that followed ended in a Jedi victory, but the question at the root of every schism, whether the bowgun could be studied without corruption, was never resolved. Over 17,000 years later, a Jedi Knight turned alchemist named Sorcerers Sin would write about Zendor in a chronicle collected in the Book of Sith. Sin had left the Order for the same reasons Zendor had, and she fought in the 100-Year Darkness, a war separated from the First Great Schism by millennia of quiet. She claimed Zendor's legacy directly, writing that her group of exiles were the heirs to his bold heresy. Zendor would have recognized Sin's grievances. He might not have recognized what she did with them. The 100-Year Darkness would produce exiles who travel further than Zendor ever did, and on the far side of the galaxy, they would find a species already steeped in the bowgun, waiting in tombs carved from red stone. Chapter 3. The Jedi Order. On Ossus, the Jedi grew from a refugee community into a galactic institution. They built the Great Library, one of the largest repositories of knowledge in the Republic, staffed by scholars and archivists who cataloged everything from hyperspace routes to extinct languages. They trained new generations of students, recruited Force-sensitive children from across the galaxy, and dispatched members to dozens of worlds as peacekeepers, diplomats, and mediators. Within a few centuries of leaving Tython, the Order had become the Republic's most trusted partner in governance, a position it would occupy for the next 20,000 years. But the Code didn't settle everything. The Order had chosen Ashla over Bowgun, yet its members held competing ideas about what the Force actually was. The Jedi had believed in the equal embrace of Ashla and Bowgun. The New Order had rejected that premise and committed to the light side. However, the light side was a broad concept, and different masters interpreted it in very different ways. Some saw the Jedi as protectors of the weak, with service as the Order's highest calling. Others treated the Order as a school, built to study the Force and pass that understanding to the next generation. A few valued discipline above all, convinced that a Jedi who mastered themselves had already mastered everything else. The disagreements were real, and they needed a structure to contain them. In the Jedi Path, a training manual written from the perspective of Grand Master Faye Coven, the answer came in the form of a 5-line code that would govern the institution for thousands of years. The Jedi Code, transcribed by a scholar named Harmonix Rectonia during the Mandaron period, laid out the Order's core philosophy in 5 paired statements. Emotion gave way to peace, ignorance to knowledge, passion to serenity, chaos to harmony, and death to force. The Code was not a set of laws or a list of punishable offenses. Grandmaster Coven described it as a pledge to the citizens of the Republic and a map of the Order's relationship with the Force, something to aspire towards, not a standard to be enforced with punishment. In practice, however, the Code transformed daily life at every level. Members were taught to let go of personal attachments, to process anger instead of acting on it, and to seek clarity before committing to action. Romantic relationships were discouraged, and possessions were minimal. Training began in early childhood, and candidates who arrived at the temple too old were frequently turned away on the grounds that their emotional habits were already too deeply set. The recruitment pipeline, which involved identifying Force-sensitive children on distant worlds and separating them from their families with parental consent, drew criticism from non-Jedi cultures for millennia. The Zeison Sha, the Matukai, and the Baran Do Sages, 3 traditions that emerged centuries after Ossus, all trace part of their origin to resentment of that pipeline and the assumptions behind it. The Jedi saw recruitment as a gift. A child born Force-sensitive could train with the best teachers in the galaxy and join an order devoted to public service. The families who watched their children leave saw it differently, and the cultures that produced their own Force traditions, only to watch the Jedi recruit their most talented members away, never forgave them for it. The Code also created hierarchy. Masters sat on the High Council, Knights served in the field, Padawans studied under a single master for years before earning promotion, and initiates trained in groups at the temple, competing for the attention of a knight who might take them on. A student who was not chosen by a certain age was reassigned to the Jedi Service Corps, an auxiliary branch divided into 3 divisions: the Agri Corps, which managed farming and land restoration on Republic worlds, the Medical Corps, which provided healing in undeserved regions, and the Exploration Corps, which charted unknown hyperspace routes. The Service Corps was not a punishment, and its members fed populations, treated plagues, and mapped the galaxy's edges. However, it was widely understood as a consolation prize, and many students who washed out of the night track carried the sting for the rest of their lives. Although the code set a foundation and governed behavior, it never addressed how the Force worked or whether it had a will of its own. On that question, the Order split into two camps, and the disagreement ran through the institution's entire history without ever producing a winner. One camp followed what they called the living force, the raw, immediate energy a Jedi could sense when walking through a jungle, standing in a crowded market, or touching a dying animal. The living force was close, physical, and present. Every tangible force ability, running faster, jumping higher, sensing danger, moving objects, calming a hostile creature, was a product of the living force. Masters who favor this approach believe the Force spoke most clearly through the present moment, and that a Jedi's first duty was to respond to the needs directly in front of them. They tended to be field workers, diplomats, and warriors who spent their time outside the temple walls, solving problems with their hands and their instincts. The other camp followed the unifying force, a vast cosmic current that threaded through stars, galaxies, and the fabric of space and time. The unifying force was distant, abstract, and prophetic. Its advocates believed the Force carried a will and a direction, and that a Jedi's duty was to perceive that direction and move with it. Visions of the future, communion with the dead, and the possibility of surviving death through the Force were all tied to the unifying force. Its advocates tended to be scholars, seers, and archivists who spent years in the Great Library, reading currents that most Jedi couldn't perceive. Both groups accepted the code, rejected the bowgun, and believed with equal conviction that they were following the light. The tension between action and contemplation, between responding to the moment and reading the current of destiny, became a permanent feature of Jedi culture. It was rarely hostile, but it was always present, shaping how the Council made decisions, how masters trained their students, and how the Order responded to crises. Centuries later, the divide would play out in the debate between Qui-Gon Jinn, a living Force advocate who trusted his instincts over the Council's deliberations, and the High Council that frequently overruled them. Qui-Gon was an heir to a philosophical tradition as old as the Order, one that the Council's unifying force majority had never fully accepted. But outside the philosophical debates, a more dangerous pattern was taking form, one the Council couldn't contain through conversation. Throughout the Order's history, individuals kept walking away. The Jedi vs. Sith reference guide records that only 19 Jedi Masters officially renounced their commissions before Count Dooku made it 20 during the final decades of the Republic. The Council called them the Lost 20, and their busts lined the archives in the Jedi Temple on Coruscant as a reminder. Most of the Lost 20 departed quietly and disappeared into civilian life, but a few left violently, and those departures followed a recognizable pattern. A gifted member grew frustrated with the Order's boundaries, studied forbidden knowledge, petitioned the Council to expand their training, and was turned down. What happened next depended on temperament. Some left peacefully, others took followers with them, and a few came back as enemies. One of the most consequential departures happened around 2000 BBY, when a Jedi Master named Fannius left the Order and resurfaced as Darth Ruin, the Sith Lord who ignited the New Sith Wars, a 1,000-year conflict that nearly destroyed the Republic. However, the departure that did more to change the galaxy than any other happened over 10,000 years before Fannius, when a group of Jedi on Ossus began experimenting with something the Code had not anticipated: the ability to reshape living creatures through the Force. In 7003 BBY, the Second Great Schism tore the Order apart. In the Tales of the Jedi comics, a faction of knights discovered that the Force, applied with enough intensity, could alter living organisms at the cellular level. They called the practice alchemy. Early experiments involved animals. A docile herbivore twisted into something faster, stronger, and more aggressive. Its bones thickened, its muscles doubled, its temperament overwritten by the Force until the original creature was unrecognizable. Then, the alchemists moved to more complex subjects. The results were weapons disguised as biology, hulking predators fused with dark side energy, driven by engineered rage, and answering only to the alchemists who had made them. The Council condemned the practice. Alchemy violated the Code's emphasis on harmony and serenity. It treated living things as raw material rather than expressions of the Force, and the creatures it produced radiated the bowguns so intensely that their presence corrupted everything around them, pulling nearby Jedi towards aggression and fear. The Council demanded the alchemists to stop. The alchemists, led by a knight named Aing-Tii, refused. They believed they discovered something the Jedi Code couldn't explain. The Force was not just an energy field to be listened to. Anyone sensitive could hone their connection in order to direct, sculpt, and remake its power, and the creatures that they had made were proof. 3 years of escalating tension followed. In 7000 BBY, the conflict erupted into open war that became known as the 100-Year Darkness. The alchemists, now calling themselves Dark Jedi, built armies around their creations. Leviathans, war beasts the size of buildings that could drain the life energy from everything around them, became the signature weapon of the conflict. The Book of Sith preserves the war from the alchemist perspective. Swords of Sin describe growing leviathans from raw biological material and using them to splinter the Temple Force's defenses at Balmorra. Aing-Tii directed campaigns across Republic space, while Sin and the other alchemists bred increasingly dangerous creatures to fill their ranks. From the Council's perspective, the Dark Jedi had raised an army of abominations and turned it loose on the Republic. The Jedi dispatched war parties to track the alchemists from star system to star system, but the Dark Jedi were mobile, well supplied, and willing to use techniques that the Order would not touch. The war burned across dozens of worlds over a full century. Entire planetary populations were caught between two armies of Force users, and the collateral damage was staggering. Civilizations that were not part of the dispute were shattered by the fighting. The war ended in 6900 BBY at the Battle of Korbas, a mining world in the deep core. The Jedi cornered the last of the Dark Jedi forces on Korbas and broke them. The Dark Jedi who surrendered were roughly a dozen leaders and an unknown number of followers. The Jedi stripped them of their weapons and navigational equipment, loaded them onto unarmed transport ships, and pushed them out of Republic space. The exiles drifted through uncharted territory for years before finding what they were looking for: a red sand world called Korriban, orbiting a dying star, home to a species called the Sith. What the exiles built on Korriban would become the single most dangerous rival the Order ever faced. But the Sith weren't just an enemy, they had their own code, their own rituals, and their own answer to how the Force should be used. The exiles who left Korbas in chains arrived on Korriban as conquerors, and what they built there would outlast every empire in the galaxy. Chapter 4: The Sith Religion. The exiles arrived on Korriban with nothing. Their weapons had been confiscated, their navigational instruments destroyed, and they had no maps, no coordinates, and no way to contact the Republic they had been expelled from. In the Book of Sith, the alchemist Swords of Sin guided the fleet through uncharted space, following legends and rumors about a species strong in the Bogun that lived on the galaxy's eastern fringe. The journey took years. Several ships were lost to hyperspace accidents. By the time the fleet reached Korriban, the exiles were desperate, starving, and running on anger. What they found was a world that felt like it had been waiting for them. Sin described Korriban as the world that seemed the loudest for anyone who could hear the Bogun's voice. The planet was arid and wind-stripped, its canyons lined with stone tombs carved into the cliff faces. The species that lived there, the Sith, were red-skinned humanoids divided into rigid castes and ruled by a king named Hakagram Grouch. They had their own connection to the Force, channeled through priests and burial rituals stretching back millennia, and they had never encountered anyone from the wider galaxy. To the native Sith, the Force was the substance of their religion, woven into every funeral, every coronation, and every war. The exiles didn't ask permission, they took the planet. Sin's Chronicle describes how the Dark Jedi General Aing-Tii challenged Grouch directly and killed him. The execution was public and deliberate. Paul beheaded the Sith King in front of his court, a display of Force power so complete that the Sith leaders who had not fled folded within weeks. The 12 exiles, Paul, Sin, the Swordmaster Zozan, the Alchemist Karnes Moore, the Admiral Baron Remulus Drapa, and 7 others, divided Korriban's territory among themselves and installed themselves as rulers over a population that had no means of resisting Force users of their caliber. The native Sith were organized into 4 castes, each one locked into a role that defined every aspect of life, from birth to death. The Kasai were priests who studied the Force through ritual and ancestor worship. When the exiles arrived, the Kasai were the first to recognize the newcomer's power, and they began treating Aing-Tii as the living incarnation of Typhogem, the left-handed god, a deity in Sith mythology associated with destruction and consumption. The Zuguric were engineers who built the tombs, temples, and obelisks that line Korriban's valleys, working in stone and metal with a craftsmanship that impressed even the exiles. The Massassi were warriors, bred and conditioned for combat across generations, who served whatever master commanded them without question, and the Grathu were slaves, the lowest caste, who performed the labor that kept the other three castes fed and clothed. Sin studied the native Sith more closely than any of the other exiles, and she reached a conclusion that would transform Korriban's population for centuries. Their blood was compatible enough with the exiles' biology to permit crossbreeding. Over generations, the bloodlines merged. The descendants of the original 12 exiles and the native Sith species became a hybrid ruling class, Force-sensitive by birth, and trained in both Jedi combat techniques and Sith ritual magic. The word Sith, which had once referred only to the native species, expanded to describe the entire civilization, its religion, and eventually its philosophy. Sin's second contribution was more dangerous than conquest. She gave the Sith their science. Sin's alchemy built on the techniques that had caused the 100-Year Darkness, refined through knowledge she extracted from the Kisai priests over years of study and experimentation. Sith alchemy operated on two tracks, each one its own discipline. The first involved non-living material. Swords, armor, and amulets could be infused with the Force during their forging, and each one retained a permanent imprint of its creator's power. Sin wrote that any object touched with alchemical science became Force-sensitive in its own right, carrying a mirror image of its forger's rage and will for as long as the object existed. A Sith sword forged 5,000 years ago still radiated the anger of the alchemist who made it. A tomb sealed in the pre-Republic era still whispered to anyone who walked through its corridors. The Sith didn't just leave behind buildings and bones, they left behind weapons that were still dangerous millennia after their creators had turned to dust. Sith swords forged through this process could deflect blaster bolts and resist lightsaber blades, and each one carried a reservoir of dark side energy that its wielder could draw on in combat. The swords were mirrors of the original weapons carried by the first Jedi on Tython, but where the Jedi had forged their blades through meditation and focus, the Sith forged theirs through rage and will. The second track was far more dangerous and involved living organisms. Sin described reshaping animals at the cellular level, twisting their anatomy and temperament until the original creature was unrecognizable. The process was violent. The subject's own Force energy fought the alchemist during the transformation, resisting the changes at every stage. Many early experiments died on the table. The survivors became Sith spawn, war beasts loyal to their creators and saturated with the bowgun. The Leviathans, the same class of creature that had fought for the Dark Jedi during the 100-Year Darkness, reappeared on Korriban in new and more dangerous forms. Sin had not abandoned the science that had gotten her exiled. She had perfected it. The Sith also codified their beliefs into a formal creed. The Jedi Code taught surrender of emotion. The Sith Code, attributed in the Jedi vs. Sith reference guide to Lord Cortis of the Korriban Academy, taught the opposite. The code opened with the declaration that peace was a lie and that only passion was real. Each line built on the one before it. Passion led to strength, strength led to power, power led to victory, and victory severed the chains weighing a Sith down. The Jedi Code described what a Jedi should aspire to become. The Sith Code, on the other hand, described what a Sith should break free from. The Sith defined that freedom as power without limits, authority without oversight, and strength without apology. For nearly 1,000 years, the Sith Empire grew in isolation. The original exiles eventually died, and the generations that followed had no idea the Republic or the Jedi still existed. The Empire's isolation ended in 5000 BBY, when two Republic hyperspace explorers named Gav and Jory Darrigan stumbled onto Sith space by accident. The tales of the Jedi comics describe how the Darrigan's arrival set off a power struggle between two Sith lords, Nagasato, a cunning expansionist who saw the Republic as a target for conquest, and Ludo Kresh, a conservative traditionalist who wanted the outsiders destroyed before they could report back. Sato won the argument through violence, murdering Kresh's allies and staging an attack that he blamed on the Republic to justify mobilization. He then used the Darrigan's hyperspace coordinates to launch an invasion. The Great Hyperspace War was short and catastrophic. Sato's fleets attacked Coruscant, Koros Major, and several other Republic worlds simultaneously, using Sith meditation spheres to cast darkside illusions that made his forces look larger than they were. The Republic reeled. Entire defense fleets pull back from their positions, convinced they were outnumbered by phantom armadas. Nevertheless, the Jedi rallied a defense, and when they broke through Sato's illusions, the true size of the Sith fleet became clear, large enough to cause damage, but not large enough to win a prolonged war. Sato ordered a retreat. The Republic's counterattack was merciless. Jedi and Republic forces pursued Sato's fleet back into Sith space and bombarded Korriban, Ziost, and the other Sith worlds until the Empire's infrastructure was rubble. Sato fled to the jungle moon of Yavin 4, where he placed his Massassi warriors into suspended animation and sealed himself into a tomb to await a future disciple. The Sith Empire, as a galactic power, was finished. Nevertheless, the religion survived. It passed from master to apprentice, sometimes in secret, sometimes in open war, through the Great Sith War, the Jedi Civil War, and the New Sith Wars over the following 4,000 years. Each generation of Sith Lords rebuilt, expanded, fought the Jedi, and fell. The cycle repeated so many times that the Jedi began to expect it. Every few centuries, a new Sith threat would emerge. The Order would crush it, and a period of quiet would follow. The Jedi treated the cycle as proof that the bowgun always consumed its followers. The Sith saw each failure as a lesson for the next attempt. In roughly 1000 BBY, a Sith Lord named Darth Bane decided the cycle was the problem. In the Darth Bane novel trilogy, Bane was a member of the Brotherhood of Darkness, a Sith army thousands strong that had fought the Jedi to a stalemate during the New Sith Wars. The Brotherhood's leader, Lord Khan, believed in shared power. Every Sith carried an equal vote, and no single master commanded the rest. Bane considered Khan's model a betrayal of everything the Sith Code stood for. An order built on passion, ambition, and personal power could not run as a democracy. When Sith power was spread across thousands, each individual was weak. The Code demanded that chains be broken. Khan's Brotherhood was a chain disguised as fellowship. Bane engineered the Brotherhood's destruction at the 7th Battle of Ruusan, a forested world in the Mid-Rim, by manipulating Khan into using a weapon called the Thought Bomb, a dark-side detonation that killed every force sensitive in its radius, Sith and Jedi alike. The blast consumed the Brotherhood, the Jedi task force that had been fighting them, and the entire battlefield. Bane was the only Sith who survived, because he was the only one who had planned not to be there when the weapon detonated. From the ashes of Ruusan, Bane instituted the rule of two. One master to command the power, one apprentice to crave it. The master would train the apprentice until the apprentice grew strong enough to kill the master and take a new apprentice of their own. The chain would continue. Each generation grew stronger than the last, until a Sith powerful enough to destroy the Jedi emerged. The rule of two might appear as a military strategy, but Bane saw it as something deeper than strategy, a complete reimagining of what the Sith should become. He looked at 4,000 years of Sith failure and concluded that the problem was never the philosophy. The problem was the Sith themselves. There were too many, too divided, and too busy fighting each other to finish the war with the Jedi. But two Sith hidden in the shadows, patient and focused, could accomplish what 10,000 Sith Lords screaming on a battlefield could not. The rule of two produced a 1,000-year lineage operating in complete secrecy, each master training a single successor, each successor eventually killing the master and starting the cycle again. The line ran from Bane through dozens of anonymous Sith Lords until it reached Darth Sidious, the Naboo senator who infiltrated the Republic's government from within and fulfilled the rule's promise by destroying the Jedi Order in a single night. But Bane's was not the only version of the Sith religion that survived into the modern era. 5,000 years before Ruusan, a Sith warship had crashed on a planet the Republic had never heard of, and its crew had built something unrecognizable. In 5000 BBY, during the Great Hyperspace War, the Sith dreadnought Omen was dispatched by Nagasato to deliver a shipment of lignan crystals, rare minerals that amplify dark-side energy to the front lines. In the Lost Tribe of the Sith novella series, the Omen was ambushed by Jedi interceptors. During the escape into hyperspace, a collision with a sister ship knocked the Omen off course and sent it crashing onto Kesh, a remote world in wild space with no hyperspace-capable technology and no contact with the wider galaxy. The crew survived, but the ship's communications equipment and hyperdrive were destroyed. The metals that were needed to repair the Omen did not exist on Kesh. Captain Yaru Corson, the ranking officer, quickly realized that rescue was not coming and that the crew's survival depended on the native population. The Kashiri, a purple-skinned near-human species, worshipped a pantheon of sky gods called the Skyborn. In Kashiri mythology, the Skyborn had fought a great war against the evil gods called the Other Side, and the blood from their wounds had fallen onto the sea and formed the continents of Kesh. The Sith crash had split a mountain. From the Kashiri perspective, something had fallen from the sky exactly where the Skyborn were supposed to live. Corson saw the opportunity and took it. He told the Kashiri that the Sith were the Skyborn returned to the planet. He backed the claim with lightsabers and telekinesis, technologies that the Kashiri had never seen. A geologist named Adari Val, a Kashiri outcast branded as a heretic by her own people for teaching that Kesh's continents were formed by volcanic activity rather than divine blood, became the Sith's first local contact. She introduced the newcomers to the Kashiri leaders, the Neshtavar priesthood, and the Sith displaced them within weeks. Corson declared himself Grand Lord. The Kashiri built a temple over the Omen's crash site, and the lost tribe of the Sith began. 5,000 years of isolated Sith evolution followed, completely cut off from Korriban, the Rule of Two, and every other branch of Sith tradition. The tribe developed its own power structure, a Grand Lord ruling through a circle of lords with a hierarchy of Sith Lords, Sith Sabers, and Sith Tyros beneath them. Internal politics ran on betrayal and murder. Corson killed his own half-brother Devor on the day of the crash. His wife Sela plotted to overthrow him for decades. Adari Val, the geologist who had introduced the Sith to the Kashiri, eventually realized that her gods were liars and organized an underground resistance that ended with 1,000 Kashiri rebels fleeing across the ocean to warn a second continent about the Sith threat. In 4985 BBY, the tribe purged its own ranks along species lines. The Red Sith members of the crew, descendants of the original Korriban species, poisoned a Kashiri settlement's water supply, killing 18,000 people. Corson used the incident as justification to exterminate every Red Sith on Kesh. From that point forward, the Lost Tribe was a purely human institution ruling over a Kashiri population that outnumbered them by millions. The centuries that followed tested the tribe's survival. Around 4000 BBY, the leadership fractured during a period known as the Time of Rot, when competing Sith factions turned on each other and the tribe's unity disintegrated into civil war. Kesh suffered. Grand Lord Varno Hiltz, a historian who seized power around 3000 BBY, pulled the tribe back together by doing something no previous Grand Lord had ever attempted. He studied the tribe's own past. Hiltz recovered records from the Omen's original crew, reconstructed the tribe's founding history, and used it to give factions that had been fighting among themselves for centuries a shared identity worth preserving. Hiltz also discovered the existence of Alanciar, a second continent across the ocean where descendants of Adari Val's original resistance had spent 2,000 years preparing for a Sith invasion. When the tribe finally reached Alanciar, they found a fully militarized society that had been drilling anti-Sith combat tactics for longer than most galactic civilizations had existed. Kesh had its own Force history, predating the Lost Tribe by nearly 20,000 years. The Lost Tribe of the Sith Spiral comics reveal that a group of Jedi and Dark Jedi had crash-landed on Kesh sometime after the 100-Year Darkness and fought a war that scarred the planet, called the Great Calamity. The Kashiri remember the conflict as a battle between the Protectors and the Destructors, two divine factions in their mythology. After the war, the surviving Jedi and Dark Jedi made peace, sealed their most dangerous member, the Dark Jedi Remulus Drapa, in a stasis casket called an oubliette, and retreated to the frozen polar continent of Eshkreen. They became known as the Doomed, a community dedicated to refusing both sides of the Force. The Doomed regarded Force sensitivity as a curse and forbade any of their members from leaving Kesh while they could still touch the Force. For 4,000 years, they monitored the Lost Tribe from a distance using ice-generated images and never intervened. Even as the Sith enslaved the Kashiri for millennia, the Doom perished in 2974 BBY when Drapa was freed from his oubliette and launched a brief, violent rebellion against the tribe. Every member of the Doom died in the fighting. The community that had spent 4,000 years pursuing neutrality was wiped out within weeks. The Lost Tribe's isolation ended in 41 ABY when a Sith meditation sphere called Ship landed on Kesh and offered the tribe something it had wanted since the day the Omen crashed: a way off the planet. Ship trained a young Sith apprentice named Vestara Kai and helped the tribe scavenge enough parts to rebuild the Omen and assemble a small fleet. The Lost Tribe launched into the galaxy and immediately collided with Luke Skywalker's New Jedi Order. The tribe's 5,000-year isolation had produced Sith who were numerous, organized, and skilled in political cunning, but who had no knowledge of the rule of two, no connection to Palpatine's empire, and no experience fighting Jedi who had survived the Clone Wars. The confrontation ran through the entire Fate of the Jedi series and ended with the tribe badly diminished but not destroyed. The Lost Tribe proved something the Jedi had never seriously considered, that the Sith religion could evolve independently, producing a civilization with its own politics, its own mythology, and its own internal conflicts, all without any contact with the Sith mainstream. Korriban's legacy was not a single tradition. It was a seed that could take root anywhere the bowgun found soil. 5,000 years on a single world, cut off from every other Sith who had ever lived, and the bowgun had lost nothing. If anything, isolation sharpened it. The Sith were the most visible alternative to the Jedi, but they were far from the only one. Across the galaxy, other Force users had found the bowgun on their own terms, through paths that never crossed Korriban or the Sith Code. Chapter 5. Dark Side Beyond the Sith. The lineage that ran from Magenta Pall to Darth Sidious was the most documented path to the bowgun, but other groups had found it on their own. Some of them predated the Sith Empire, others sprang up in its shadow, and at least one rejected the model of light and dark that the Jedi and Sith had been fighting over for millennia. The Sorcerers of Tund were among these strangest. The Jedi vs. Sith reference guide, which provides the most detailed surviving account of the Order, describes how the Sorcerers occupied the planet Tund in the Outer Rim for thousands of years. Their origins trace back to the aftermath of the Great Hyperspace War around 5000 BBY, when Kasai heretics, members of the priestly caste of the original Sith species, fled the destruction of the Sith Empire and settled on Tund. Cut off from Korriban and the Sith who escaped the destruction, these exile priests built a new tradition that gradually shed its Sith identity and replaced it with something the galaxy had never seen before. The Sorcerers rejected the light and dark duality outright. The Jedi divided the Force into light and dark, and the Sith embraced the dark and rejected the light. The Sorcerers, meanwhile, dismissed both positions and called the Force by a different name, the Unity. They treated the Force as a single indivisible entity with no sides, no moral guides, and no natural preference for how it was used. The Unity was everything. Separating it into light and dark, the Sorcerers believe, was like separating fire into heat and light. Both came from the same source, and treating them as opposites made no sense. The division was meaningless, and any tradition built on it was chasing a distinction that didn't exist. Rather than calling their abilities Force use, the Sorcerers called them magic. They presented themselves to the galaxy as wizards, performed feats that looked indistinguishable from Force abilities, and wrapped everything they did in ritual, mysticism, and deliberate obscurity. Their powers were real. Their explanation for those powers was intentionally theatrical, and the theater served a purpose. It kept outsiders from understanding what the Sorcerers actually believed. The Jedi noticed the Sorcerers, but never understood them. The Jedi Council periodically sent representatives to Tund to recruit the Sorcerers into the Order, arguing that they would benefit from studying the Force without what the Council called the trappings of magic and mysticism. The Sorcerers declined every time. Some of them demonstrated abilities at least as strong as those of the Jedi recruiters who came to persuade them, which made the refusal difficult to argue with. Eventually, the Council gave up on recruitment and settled for monitoring. The Jedi allowed the Sorcerers to study the Force in their own fashion, on the condition that they didn't cross into the teachings of the bowgun. The irony was layered. The Sorcerers didn't believe the bowguns existed as a separate phenomenon, and the Jedi were monitoring them for signs of a corruption the Sorcerers' own theology denied was possible. The last official Jedi visit to Tund happened well over 1,000 years before the rise of the Empire, during the New Sith Wars, and after that, the Sorcerers were left alone. Imperial-era records indicate that Emperor Palpatine had a strong interest in the Sorcerers and that their religious teachings were based on an archaic interpretation of original Sith philosophy. If true, the Sorcerers of Tund had come full circle. A tradition that began with exiled Sith priests had shed its Sith identity, invented its own theology of the Unity, practiced for millennia in plain sight, and been identified by the galaxy's most powerful Sith Lord as kin. The Sorcerer's story ended with a single act of betrayal. The last known Sorcerer of Tund was the Order's last surviving member, a being named Roker Gepta, and Gepta was not what he appeared to be. Gepta was actually a croak, a tiny snail-like species that were natural masters of camouflage and illusion. He had infiltrated the sorcerers using his species' gift for disguise, studied their teachings until he had absorbed everything they knew, and then decided that no one else should have what he had learned. He used a bioweapon to kill not just the sorcerers, but every living thing on Tund's surface, over 18 million beings in total. The planet was left an irradiated wasteland. The being who claimed the title of last Sorcerer of Tund was a parasite wearing the skin of a dead tradition. After the genocide, Gepta made contact with Emperor Palpatine and traded the sorcerer's secrets for control of the Centrality, a quiet sector in the Outer Rim where no one would ask questions. From that position, Gepta eventually crossed paths with Lando Calrissian, a gambler and smuggler who would later become a general in the Rebel Alliance. Calrissian described Gepta's eyes as spiraling, predatory, and consumed by hunger, and their final confrontation ended with Calrissian killing the Croak. The Sorcerers of Tund were finished. Their planet was dead. Their unity theology, a genuinely unique interpretation of the Force that had no parallel anywhere else in the galaxy, died with Gepta. The only record that the tradition ever existed sat in Jedi archives and Imperial intelligence files. But everywhere in the galaxy, the bowgun had found a very different kind of vessel. On Dathomir, the bowgun wore a different face. It grew out of exile, motherhood, and the domestication of monsters. In approximately 600 BBY, the Jedi Council banished a fallen Jedi Knight named Alia on Dathomir. The reason they stated was contemplation. The Council wanted Alia to meditate on the living Force in isolation, but the actual destination was a prison colony. Dathomir was home to some of the Republic's worst criminals, exiled to a planet so remote and dangerous that escape was virtually impossible. The jungle was dense, the wildlife was lethal, and the dominant predators were rancors, multi-ton carnivores with claws the size of a human torso. Alia didn't meditate. She conquered. Using her Force abilities, she subjugated the criminal exiles and the other desperate life forms on the planet and built the foundation of a female-led society in which men had little or no power. She tamed the rancors, turning the planet's most dangerous predators into mounts and companions. In the oral history of a rancor herd leader named Tosh, the first bond between rancor and witch began when a witch healed a sick rancor and rode on its back. Dathomiri rancors were not mindless animals. They were semi-sentient, capable of basic communication and craftsmanship. In exchange for teaching them to forge weapons and armor, the rancors pledged to love the witches and serve them. The partnership lasted for centuries, and it became the image that came to define Dathomiri culture: a woman in animal hides riding a rancor through the jungle, commanding the Force through broken spells. Alia wrote the Book of Law, a code of conduct for her daughters and their descendants. The book was structured around 6 precepts, each pairing a warning with a goal. Those who suffered emotion would never find peace. Those who chose ignorance would never know their own greatness. Those who yielded to passion would fail to lead, and those who feared death would never achieve real power. The final 2 precepts dealt with magic directly. It must always be used wisely, and a witch must never concede to evil. The structure echoed the Jedi Code, but the priorities were different. The Jedi Code sought serenity, while Alia's code pursued power channeled through discipline. The language was simpler, more practical, built for a society where the Force was taught as survival skill rather than spiritual philosophy. The witches didn't meditate in temples. They hunted, bred rancors, fought each other in clan disputes, and governed through female-led councils where men had no voice. The Nightsisters emerged when a faction of witches decided that Alia's Book of Law didn't go far enough. Exiles from the witch clans who embraced the bowgun formed their own clan and created their own traditions. The Nightsisters enslaved males, practiced aggressive Force techniques that other clans forbade, and took perverse pleasure in the fear that their reputation generated. From the outside, the Nightsisters looked like a straightforward dark side cult, a group of witches who had gone bad. But the writings of the Nightsister clan mother Talzin in the Book of Sith tells a very different story. Talzin wrote that the Nightsisters were not heretics, the light side witch clans were. Talzin claimed that after Alia's death, some of her daughters, weakened by the Jedi blood in their veins, altered the Book of Law by introducing the concepts of good and evil. They claimed that Alia had spoken these words during the last moments of her life. Talzin called the altercation a blasphemy. The witches who rejected the text they had changed and kept to what Talzin described as Alia's original, uncorrupted teachings became the first Nightsisters. They compiled their own volume, the Book of Shadows, and regarded it as the true preservation of Alia's vision. Talzin's theology went further than any Jedi or Sith worldview. She rejected both. Talzin wrote that other groups, like the Jedi and the Sith, used strange cold terms to describe the work of the spirits, and that the Nightsisters should forgive their ignorance. There was no need to separate the living force from the unifying force. Both were manifestations of what Talzin called the twin deities, the winged goddess and the fanged god, and both were vibrantly alive. The spirit plane existed parallel to the physical world, inhabited by the essences of animals, ancestors, and the forces of nature, and the classification of light side and dark side was misguided. Talzin asked whether it was evil to kill when predators needed to eat and ecosystems needed death to survive. What the Jedi called the dark side, the Nightsisters knew as the essence of life. Talzin's authority was not institutional, it was spiritual. She described her writings as the commands of the spirits, and she warned that challenging her authority meant challenging life. Luke Skywalker, who annotated the Book of Sith after recovering it, wrote that he had spent considerable time among the Witches of Dathomir, but had never gathered as much insight into Nightsister theology as Talzin's chapter provided. The Jedi's handling of Dathomir added another layer. The Chuanthor was a Jedi Praxium ship, a mobile training academy that traveled between systems, educating students in deep space. When it crashed on Dathomir around 340 BBY, the Jedi aboard encountered the witches and couldn't retrieve the vessel. The Council erased the incident from their records. The erasure conveniently covered up the fact that a previous council had been responsible for banishing Alia to Dathomir in the first place. The training materials left aboard the Chuanthor were eventually recovered by Luke Skywalker with the witches' cooperation, meaning the Jedi's cover-up had delayed access to their own educational resources by centuries. Dathomir's Force traditions grew from the ground, shaped by jungle, rancor, and ritual. The next group of Bowgun practitioners came from the opposite direction. They moved through the halls of galactic power, and their authority came from prophecy and political plans. The prophets of the dark side were not mystics, they were operatives. The prophets were founded by Darth Millennial, a Sith Lord who rejected Darth Bane's rule of two in favor of Lord Khan's older philosophy of rule by the strong. Millennial believed that Bowgun should be shared among many, not concentrated in two, and he abandoned the Sith lineage to start his own movement. He meditated on Sith teachings, combined them with the theories of pre-Republic thinkers, and created a religion he called the Dark Force. Millennial declared himself a prophet chosen by the will of the Force, and he attracted Force users from across space who were drawn to his message. The most powerful members of the prophets were adept at using the Force to predict future events. This ability was their specialty, and it made them valuable in ways that raw combat power could not match. Sometime before the Clone Wars, Palpatine's alter ego Darth Sidious discovered the prophets and conscripted them as his advisors. He entrusted them with the training of dark-side adepts, including the Force-sensitive Grand Admiral Nihil Declan. The prophets became a quiet arm of Palpatine's network, a group of seers who served the Empire's long game by reading the currents of the future and reporting what they saw. The prophets' leadership reflected their strange position between the Jedi and Sith worlds. Supreme Prophet Kadan had been a Jedi Knight before the Clone Wars, a member of the Order who had walked away and reinvented himself in the Bowgun service. High Prophet Jedgar had abandoned the Jedi Order at age 13 after no knight would accept him as a Padawan, driven away by the nightmares that plagued his sleep. Both men had started as Jedi washouts. Both had found purpose in an organization that valued the one Force ability the Jedi treated with the most suspicion, the ability to see what didn't happen. The prophets and their loyal assistants reportedly fled Coruscant shortly after Palpatine left for the Endor system. Whether they had foreseen the end of the Empire remains unknown. So does their fate. They vanished from the historical record as completely as the Sorcerers of Tund had, but without the dramatic punctuation of a planetary extinction. The prophets disappeared into hiding on the remote world of Bostharda. They were eventually tracked down and killed by the Dark Lady Lumia and her allies, ending the Dark Force religion for good. The sorcerers called the Force the Unity, the witches called it magic and divided it into spells. The prophets called it the Dark Force and used it to read the future. All three traditions practiced the bowgun on their own terms, outside the Sith lineage, and all three were eventually consumed by the forces that they served. The sorcerers by a parasite from within, the witches by the Jedi Order's refusal to truly understand them, and the prophets by the Empire that they had attached themselves to. Not every Force tradition outside the Jedi grew from the bowgun. Some were born from the Jedi Order's own failures, founded by people who had been abandoned, displaced, or disillusioned by the very institution that claimed to serve the light. Chapter 6. The Jedi's Orphans. These were the people who had been forgotten, recruited away from the cultures that raised them, or left behind when the Order moved on. All of them share a common origin. The Jedi Order's own choices created every one of them. The first of these orphan traditions, the Jensaarai, is also the strangest, because it was built on a lie. The Jedi vs. Sith reference guide describes the Jensaarai as founded during the Clone Wars by Nikos Tyrus, an Anzadi Jedi Knight who left the Order after discovering an ancient Sith manuscript in the Jedi Temple archives. From the manuscript, Tyrus extracted a version of history that turned the Jedi's self-image inside out. He came to believe that the Jedi had stolen their discipline from the Sith, and that the Jedi Order had perverted the original Sith teaching to prevent Force users from following what Tyrus called the true way. The word Sarai, Sith for truth, became the name of this movement. The Jensaarai, the hidden followers of the true way. The problem was that Tyrus's history was wrong. The manuscript had lied to him, or he had misread it, or both. The Jedi had not stolen their teachings from the Sith. The two traditions had a shared ancestor in the Jedi, but they had evolved independently after the Force Wars and the 100-Year Darkness. Tyrus built his entire movement on a false premise, and his followers inherited the distortion without knowing it. In the novel I, Jedi, which describes the Jensaarai through the eyes of Corran Horn, a New Republic pilot training as a Jedi, the Jensaarai carried a strangely twisted view of history in which Obi-Wan Kenobi and Darth Vader were considered equivalent threats, both labeled as Jedi exterminators by a tradition that couldn't tell the difference because its founding text had scrambled the categories. Tyrus was killed in the final weeks of the Clone Wars by Corran Horn's grandfather, the Clone Wars-era Jedi Knight Naja Halcyon, during a confrontation on Susefi, a remote Outer Rim world. Most of Tyrus's students died in the same fight. The survivors, stranded on Susefi, found the journal of a Jedi scholar named Lurad Noon. Noon had developed a concept he called Jiazjin, a Sith word meaning integrating the shadow, an approach that blended Jedi learning with Sith experiences into a single practice. He may have developed a theory to keep from going insane with guilt over his own exposure to Sith teachings. Whether Noon was brilliant or broken, his journal became the second founding of the Jensaarai, layered on top of Tyrus's already corrupted manuscript teachings. The tradition that grew from these contradictions had no parallel in the galaxy. The Jensaarai trained in both Jedi and Sith techniques, but committed to defense. They forged Cortosis weave armor, Cortosis being a rare metal that resisted lightsaber blades, each set individually crafted and styled after a creature the wearer felt best expressed their role in community. The creatures chosen were all defensively minded, animals that remain hidden and dormant until pressed, then prove deadly when threatened. The armor was the crowning achievement of a Jensaarai defender's training, the physical expression of a philosophy that valued protection over aggression. The Jedi's assessment was blunt. The Jensaarai had chosen the correct path for the wrong reasons. They practiced defense, which the Jedi approved of, but they practiced it because a corrupted manuscript had taught them that the Jedi were their enemies, and defending against imaginary persecution was not the same as defending out of principle. Luke Skywalker, who encountered the Jensaarai decades later, described them as something unlike any Force tradition he had encountered, including the Dathomiri witches. The Jensaarai eventually made peace with the Jedi Order and opened a student exchange program, but the scar of their false history never fully healed. Their rank structure reflected their priorities. Apprentices trained under senior members, defenders served the community, and the Sarai Kar, the Keeper of the Truth, led the entire order. Only one Sarai Kar existed at any time, and the title carried an irony the Jensaarai may never have fully appreciated. The Keeper of the Truth led an order founded on a falsehood. While the Jensaarai were built on bad information, the Zeison Sha and the Matukai were built on something worse: silence. The Zeison Sha came first. Almost 2,000 years before the rise of the Empire, a group of families and friends of the Jedi fled to the remote Outer Rim planet Yanabar to escape the conflicts that led to the new Sith Wars. The Jedi who knew the location of the refuge were killed in battle, and the colony on Yanabar was forgotten. Not abandoned in a moment of crisis, forgotten, the way a name gets lost after too many years without contact. Nobody decided to leave them behind, but nobody remembered to go back for them either. The colonists waited for rescue, but none came. Yanabar was a harsh world, and survival required the colonists to develop their Force abilities in practical directions the Jedi training had never emphasized. Their descendants built a new Force tradition, the Zeison Sha, centered on self-reliance and independence. Telekinesis became their primary discipline, and their telekinetic abilities far surpassed those of many Jedi. They developed a disc blade, a small metal circle with hand grips and 4 curved blades that protruded from its sides. A Zeison Sha warrior could throw a disc blade with telekinetic accuracy and recall it to their hand mid-flight, a weapon designed for a people who couldn't afford to lose anything. When the Jedi eventually rediscovered Yanabar, centuries after the colony had been abandoned, they tried to recruit the Zeison Sha's Force-sensitive children. The response was hostile. A Jedi scholar named Bodo Baas, writing in 580 BBY, recorded that the Zeison Sha opposed the concept of separating Force-sensitive children from their families. A Twi'lek warrior told Baas directly that without self-reliance, their ancestors would have died shortly after the Jedi left them on Yanabar. It was the Jedi who had abandoned and forgotten them, and now the same order wanted to take their children. The Zeison Sha found it unacceptable, and the weight of their resentment towards the Jedi Order lasted through time. The second group, the Matukai, came from a different kind of exclusion. They were rejected. The first Matukai was a human woman from a minor Outer Rim world called Karvas II, who discovered her ability to touch the Force while practicing a form of meditative martial arts. She was not strong enough in the Force to qualify for Jedi training. The Order's recruitment pipeline had passed her over, and she had found the Force on her own, through her body and not through meditation or instruction. What distinguished the Matukai from every other Force tradition was their method. They made the physical body the primary focus for Force abilities. The Jedi traditionally meditated when they were not exercising, while the Matukai used physical exercise as meditation. Running, fighting, stretching, breathing. Every movement was a conversation with the Force. The unique result of Matukai training was that it allowed beings without natural Force sensitivity to develop it into something real, using their bodies as the conduit. The Jedi's recruitment model selected for raw power. Children who showed strong Force sensitivity were taken, and everyone else was left behind. The Matukai's model was the opposite. Anyone willing to train hard enough could learn, regardless of how dim their connection to the Force was at the start. Their tenets centered on keeping the body clean and strong, purifying through physical activity, and avoiding any contact with the bowgun. Their weapon was the Wanshen, a tall polearm with a single-edged blade forged and molded with the aid of the Force, making the metal exceptionally hard. The Order never grew large. The Matukai numbered 50 or 60 members at any given time and lived as nomads, traveling from world to world instead of building temples or academies. Bodo Baas, the same Jedi scholar who had visited the Zeison Sha, met a Matukai leader named Mendor Typhoons in 580 BBY. Typhoons told Baas that the Jedi method of teaching the Force was both elitist and ineffective, and that he believed he could train students better than the Jedi Order could. Baas, to his credit, didn't argue. He noted that because the Matukai drew from a pool of Force users who would never qualify for Jedi training in the first place, there was no reason the two traditions couldn't coexist. The Matukai were picking up the people the Jedi had left on the table. Some of those people, Typhoons was proving, had been worth picking up all along. A margin note in the Jedi Path from famed Cerulean, the Jedi Master who later trained Count Dooku, offers a rare outside assessment. Cerulean described fighting a Matukai warrior and being surprised by the opponent's skill. A tradition built on physical conditioning, rather than Jedi-style Force meditation, had produced a fighter capable of challenging a trained Jedi Knight. The note is significant because it came from Dooku's teacher, a man positioned at the center of the Jedi hierarchy, who encountered a Force tradition outside that hierarchy and found it unexpectedly dangerous. The last of the Jedi's orphans, the Baran Do Sages, were eclipsed so gradually that nobody noticed until they were nearly gone. Thousands of years before the gas-rich world of Doran joined the Galactic Republic in 5975 BBY, the native Keldor species identified the Force and developed their own tradition around it. The first Baran Do were village seers who had a heightened weather sense, Keldor who could feel a storm coming hours or days before it arrived. Over time, their abilities expanded from weather prediction to broader levels of seeing into the future, and they became advisors and seers for Doran's leaders, reading the currents of time the way their ancestors had read the sky. After Doran joined the Republic, the Jedi welcomed Force-sensitive Keldors into their ranks. The recruitment was not hostile, it was generous. The Jedi offered training, resources, and membership in the most respected Force tradition in the galaxy. As a result, every Keldor child who left Doran for the Jedi Temple was a child who didn't train with the Baran Do. Over the centuries, the drain was slow and steady. The Baran Do dwindled from a respected national institution to a handful of elderly seers that most Caldors had never heard of. By the time of the Clone Wars, the tradition was nearly forgotten. Ironically, being forgotten saved their lives. In 19 BBY, the Sith finally achieved what the Rule of Two had been building towards for 1,000 years. Darth Sidious, operating as Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, issued Order 66, a command that turned the Republic's own clone army against the Jedi and wiped out nearly the entire Order in a single day. The Republic became the Galactic Empire, and Sidious's apprentice Darth Vader, along with a core of Force-sensitive hunters called the Imperial Inquisitors, spent the following years tracking down the survivors. The campaign became known as the Jedi Purge. Through all this, the Baran Do went unnoticed. They were too small, too obscure, and too far from the centers of galactic power to attract attention. A Baran Do elder named Dorn Tlo wrote that the Force had told them they were too few to fight and that they would be exterminated if they tried. So the Baran Do chose patience, and the Purge passed them by. What set the Baran Do apart from the other traditions born from the Jedi Order's failures was their theology of the dark side. Tlo wrote that the Baran Do had always viewed the dark side as a necessary evil, as essential to the Force as death was to life. They didn't reject it like the Jedi or worship it like the Sith. They accepted it as a permanent feature of the Force's landscape and trained their members to recognize its pull before it became dangerous. Tlo claimed that the Baran Do could predict whether a member might be drawn to the dark side and had always been able to prevent it from happening. No other Force tradition in the galaxy claimed that ability. Their training methods reflected the approach. Baran Do students practiced meditation alongside exercises in sensory deprivation and sensory overload, deliberately removing or flooding a student's senses to sharpen their Force perception. The Jedi trained through calm focus, but the Baran Do did the opposite, using control stress to sharpen their students into seers and weather readers. The method explained both their strengths and their obscurity. The Baran Do were exceptional at reading the Force's currents, but they had no combat tradition, no lightsaber training, and no interest in galactic politics. The reprieve, however, scarred their leadership. In the Fate of the Jedi Outcast novel, a Baran Do leader named Tok'ra Haz was profoundly affected by the Purge, less by the loss of individual life than by the loss of knowledge. Haz feared that the Emperor would eventually extend the same genocide to other Force-sensitive orders, and he decided the Baran Do needed an insurance policy. He sent many of the Order's most knowledgeable masters underground, literally into caverns beneath Doran's surface, where they would serve as a living repository of Baran Do knowledge. If the Empire came to destroy the sages above ground, the hidden cell would survive. The masters who went underground faked their deaths, took new names, and cut contact with the surface. Haz and the masters who followed him became known as the Hidden Ones. But then, the threat never came. The Empire never targeted the Baran Do. Order 66 ended, the Empire fell, the New Republic rose, and the Hidden Ones sat in their caverns, decade after decade, learning nothing new and teaching no one. By the time Luke Skywalker and his son Ben visited Doran during the events of Fate of the Jedi, the Empire had long since fallen, but the Hidden Ones were still underground. As a successor, a Baran Do master named Koro Zeel administered a tiny subterranean kingdom where preservation had turned into paralysis. Luke and Ben discovered the Hidden Ones after following a Baran Do master who had faked his death into the caverns below Doran's surface. Ben defeated a former Baran Do master in hand-to-hand combat, proving that years of underground isolation had degraded the master's abilities rather than preserved them. Luke confronted Zeel directly, and most of the underground masters chose to return to the surface. A Baran Do elder named Chara, who had been among the Hidden, put the failure in terms the whole order could understand. The issue was service. Service to the Baran Do and to the cause of knowledge. Hiding in a cave served neither. The Baran Do survived. They remained on Doran, smaller than they had been before the Jedi started recruiting their children, but alive and practicing. Of all the traditions born from the Jedi Order's failures, the Baran Do may be the most quietly tragic. A Force tradition that was never persecuted, never attacked, and never driven underground by an enemy, it was drained by an ally's generosity, nearly destroyed by its own fear, and saved by admitting that the bunker had been a mistake. The Jensaarai, the Zeison Sha, the Matukai, and the Baran Do all developed their Force traditions in response to the Jedi Order's blind spots, but a few groups went further than rejection of the Jedi. Chapter 7: The Mystics and Heretics. For 25,000 years, the light and dark divide had shaped every war, every schism, and every code the galaxy had produced. The Jedi built their order around it. The Sith built their religion against it. Every splinter group that broke away from either side still accepted the premise that light and dark were real, and that choosing between them was unavoidable. The three traditions that followed refused to accept that premise at all. The Fallanassi were the quietest of them, and in some ways the most radical. The Jedi vs. Sith reference guide describes the Fallanassi as a religious order of Force-using women who call the Force by a different name, the White Current. They practice pacifism as a rule of their order, binding on every member. A Fallanassi who used the Force to move an object, harm an enemy, or compel another being's behavior was violating the Order's core teaching. The only acceptable use of the Force was illusion. A Fallanassi could make a building look like a ruin. She could make a fleet of warships appear where none existed. She could wrap a person in an illusion so convincing that they would walk past her without registering her presence. Even so, she could not lift a stone, push a blade, or stop a heart. The Fallanassi cultivated that absence deliberately. The Order's origins are difficult to trace. Their earliest known home was the planet Lukazek, but they abandoned it when the Empire came looking for them. The Fallanassi moved often, settling on a world only long enough to train the next generation before relocating. Their history was oral, passed between members in private, and they did not leave behind any temples, archives, and written records. The philosophy behind the limitation was as important as the practice. The Fallanassi believed that authority had no real substance. Governments, hierarchies, military chains of command, all of them were stories that people told themselves to justify control over others. The White Current, the Fallanassi taught, was the Force experienced without the desire to control. A Jedi used the Force to protect. A Sith used it to dominate. A Fallanassi used it to disappear, because disappearing was the only use that didn't press one person's will on another. Luke Skywalker sought the Fallanassi out during the Black Fleet crisis, after a Fallanassi adept named Akana told him that his mother had been a member of their order. Akana introduced Luke to the White Current and its teachings, and Luke observed that the White Current and the Force were the same energy field described in different language. The Fallanassi disagreed. They maintained that their tradition more truly embraced the light, and that they did not approve of how the Jedi used the Force. Luke eventually discovered that Akana had lied about his mother to secure his help in finding her missing people, a manipulation that cast a shadow over everything she had taught him. The Fallanassi's theology of non-control did not, apparently, extend to lying. The Fallanassi survival strategy was consistent with their philosophy. When threatened, they fled. When the Empire discovered their existence through a member named Isela Talsava Narand, who revealed the order to an Imperial governor, the Empire offered protection in exchange for loyalty. The Fallanassi refused and scattered. During the Yavitha crisis, they merged a temple with the White Current to create an illusion of a great ruin, hiding an entire community behind a mirage. And when Luke persuaded a Fallanassi elder named Whills to aid the New Republic at the Battle of N'Zoth, Whills created a phantom fleet, an illusion of warships so convincing that the Yavitha redirected their forces to fight enemies that didn't exist. The Fallanassi won a battle without firing a shot, without lifting a weapon, and without touching a single enemy. Jacen Solo, Han and Leia's eldest son, later traveled to the Fallanassi enclave on Pydir in 35 ABY, where he received some training from Akana. He left before his training was complete, a pattern Jacen repeated with every Force tradition he visited during his journey across the galaxy. The Fallanassi noted his departure with concern, though they did not pursue him or press him to return. The second group, the Aing-Tii monks of the Cathal Rift, shared the Fallanassi's rejection of the light-dark system, but they replaced it with something far stranger. In the Fate of the Jedi Omen novel, the Aing-Tii were Force-sensitive monks who lived near the Cathal Rift, a dangerous and poorly charted region of space in the Outer Rim. Physically, they were 2-meter-tall mammals covered in jointed plates of bone, and they rarely allowed outsiders to visit their territory. They hated slavers with a ferocity that bordered on religious, and they destroyed slaver fleets without hesitation or mercy. The Aing-Tii did not view the Force as a coin with two sides, or as a spectrum with two poles, but as a rainbow. The smuggler George Cardass, whom Yoda had sent to the Aing-Tii for healing, described their philosophy in words that any outsider could grasp. The Jedi and the Sith thought of the Force in terms of black and white, but the Aing-Tii saw a full range of colors, gradations and variations that the two-sided model couldn't account for. A Jedi who used the Force to heal was using the light. A Sith who used the Force to kill was using the dark. The model had no answer for a Force user who moved an object from one place to another without any moral intent at all. The Jedi and Sith frameworks had no color for that action, but the Aing-Tii did. The Aing-Tii's abilities reflected their theology. They could do things no other Force tradition had ever described. Their ships didn't travel through hyperspace, but they materialized at their destination, disappearing from one location and appearing at another with a sharp pop of displaced air. Cardass demonstrated a small-scale version of this ability by making a decanter appear on a table from across his ship, an act of teleportation that the Jedi had no technique for and no way to explain. The Aing-Tii also practiced flow walking, a technique that allowed a user to move through time, experiencing past events or glimpsing future ones. Flow walking went beyond vision or prophecy. It was, according to the Aing-Tii, actual movement through the Force's temporal currents. The Aing-Tii referred to the Force as a gift from those who dwell beyond the veil, a phrase that pointed towards a belief system no outsider had ever been able to piece together. Some spacers believed the Aing-Tii were waiting for an answer from beings who lived past the Cathal Rift, entities that the monks treated as something between gods and ancestors. Jacen Solo visited the Aing-Tii during his multi-year journey and received training from them, including instruction in flow walking. An Aing-Tii liaison named Tadar Ro later taught Luke and Ben Skywalker during the events of Fate of the Jedi. Tadar Ro described the Force as something far more complex than light or dark, right or wrong. On the subject of teleportation, Tadar Ro taught that perception was everything if it was powerful enough. He described moving a rock by seeing it in a new location instead of its current one, and convincing his mind that the rock had always been there. The technique wasn't about pushing objects through space. It was about rewriting the Force's understanding of where an object belonged. The implications staggered Luke. If the Force responded to perception rather than physical law, then a mind strong enough could alter reality by choosing to see it differently. Jacen, Tadar Ro said, had seemed to understand the rainbow philosophy. Tadar Ro revealed as well that the Aing-Tii also believed a being did not need to be born Force-sensitive to learn to use the Force, a claim that Cardass, who was not a natural Force-sensitive, appeared to prove. By the time Luke and Ben arrived, the Aing-Tii were experiencing an internal crisis. A prophet had emerged within the Order, making apocalyptic predictions about the return of those who dwell beyond the veil. The prophecies were tearing the community apart, splitting the monks into factions that disagreed on whether the prophecies were genuine warnings or dangerous lies. Luke, after studying the rainbow philosophy, concluded that there was no place for a rainbow force within the Jedi framework. Even so, he acknowledged that the approach seemed to work for the Aing-Tii on their own terms. Ben, reflecting his own experience visiting the Sith world of Zaios, pushed back. On Zaios, he had felt genuine malevolence radiating from the ground, an imprint of thousands of years of Sith occupation. If the Force was a rainbow with no dark side, Ben wondered, he had no name for the color he had felt on Zaios. The prophet had predicted that those who dwell beyond the veil would return before his death, and then he died without the prophecy being fulfilled. Luke and Ben told the Aing-Tii that none of the sacred relics they had examined offered any guidance, and that the monks would have to decide for themselves whether the prophet was right. The Aing-Tii were briefly enraged, but eventually accepted the advice and began to heal the rift between the factions. The third group to reject the light and dark divide never formed a separate order. The Potentium movement and Vergere's teachings both grew inside the Jedi Order, and the damage they caused came from within. The Potentium movement began during the final centuries of the Old Republic, when a Jedi named Lior Hal founded a philosophical group that challenged the Order's perspective on the Force. Hal and his followers maintained that the Force could not push anyone into evil, that the universe was filled with a benign energy field whose instructions were always good. They called this energy field the Potentium and taught that it was the beginning and ending of all things, and that a person's connection to it should not be controlled or filtered by any kind of training or discipline that their order follows. The implications were radical. If the Force was inherently good, then the dark side didn't exist as a separate phenomenon. And if the dark side didn't exist, then the Jedi Order's entire reason for existing was a fabrication. Hal's followers accused the Jedi Masters of clinging to the dark side concept because abandoning it would mean admitting that the temple hierarchy was unnecessary. The Council's counter-argument, laid out by a Jedi scholar named Asli Crimson, was that the Potentium view was ultimately selfish. It allowed a person to believe that their actions were good and justified because there was no such thing as evil intent. The debate ended in expulsion. The Council removed the Potentium followers, some leaving voluntarily, others pushed out. They scattered around the galaxy, and some of them settled on Zonama Sekot, a living planet in the unknown regions, where the Force behaved unlike anywhere else in the galaxy. Zonama Sekot was saturated with the Force, and the energy there didn't register as light or dark. It was just present, woven into the planet's living ecosystem, without any pull towards the light or dark. For the Potentium settlers, Zonama Sekot was proof that the Jedi were wrong. The Force could exist without a dark side, if the environment was right. The Jedi never investigated the claim. They had already dismissed the Potentium as heresy, and a living planet in uncharted space wasn't enough to reopen the case. The entire Potentium movement may have originated as a Sith scheme designed to erode Jedi discipline from within. Millennia later, a Jedi named Vergere arrived at a related conclusion through a very different path, and the consequences were catastrophic. In the New Jedi Order, Traitor, Vergere was a Jedi Knight from the Old Republic era who had been long past the galaxy's borders for decades. When she resurfaced during the Yuuzhan Vong War, she took Jacen Solo as a student and subjected him to a punishing kind of education that stripped away everything the Jedi had taught him. Vergere's core teaching was that the Force had no dark side. The Force was one, she told Jacen. Light and dark were labels, words that describe how little the Jedi understood. What the Jedi called the dark side was the raw, unrestrained Force experienced without filters, and any Jedi who gave themselves over to the Force completely would feel what the Order had taught them to call darkness. The darkness wasn't in the energy field, it was in the person using it. The teaching was close to the Potentium's position, but carried a critical distinction. The Potentium said evil didn't exist. Vergere said evil existed but lived in the individual, not in the Force. The gardener metaphor she used with Jacen captured the difference. A gardener who chose which plants to cultivate and which to uproot, and the choice was the gardener's responsibility. Flowers and weeds were not labels the soil applied. They were labels the gardener chose. The Force, like soil, grew whatever was planted in it. Vergere also told Jacen that everything she said was a lie, a recurring warning designed to force him to evaluate her teachings rather than accept them on authority. The warning was necessary, because Vergere's philosophy contained a trapdoor. If darkness lived in the person and not in the Force, then a person who believed they were good could justify any action. A gardener who was certain of their own righteousness could uproot anything and call it a weed. The road from Vergere's teaching to Darth Caedus ran through exactly that trapdoor. Jacen Solo absorbed the lesson that the Force had no sides, concluded that his own judgment was sufficient, and used that conclusion to justify a campaign of authoritarian violence that ended with his sister killing him in a lightsaber duel aboard a Star Destroyer. The Potentium called the Force good, Vergere called it neutral, the Aing-Tii saw a rainbow, and the Fallanassi saw a current to be submitted to, not directed. 4 different answers to the same question, and none of them lined up with the Jedi's answer or each other's. The galaxy's relationship with the Force was not a debate between two sides. It was a conversation with dozens of voices, most of them talking past each other, and the loudest voices were not always the ones with the best arguments. For every tradition with temples and codes, dozens more left barely a trace. Some were forgotten by history, others crawled out of the Empire's ashes, and a few survived long enough to raise the question of what, if anything, endured. Chapter 8: The Forgotten and What Survived. The galaxy is littered with the remnants of Force traditions that never grew large enough to threaten the Jedi, attract the Sith, or earn a place in anyone's chronicle. A few of them deserve at least a mention because their existence proves something the major traditions often forgot. The Force didn't belong to anyone, and it kept surfacing in places no one was looking. The Order of Shasa took root on Manan, an ocean world better known for its culto exports than its Force traditions. During the events of the Knights of the Old Republic video game, a group of Selkath were deceived by a Sith agent into studying dark side techniques. When the deception was uncovered, the Selkath who had been trained didn't abandon what they had learned. They blended their Sith-derived abilities with Jedi ideals and built their own hybrid tradition, naming it after Shasa, the young Selkath who had first exposed the Sith manipulation. The Order of Shasa defended Manan's independence from both sides for centuries, armed with Cortosis forged curved swords called Fira, and a doctrine that borrowed freely from both sides of the Force without fully committing to either. They were small, local, and largely unknown outside the Manon system. The Jalshe took a different approach altogether. They studied the Force as an intellectual discipline rather than a martial or spiritual one, treating it the way a scholar might treat a field of research. The Jalshe developed their own method for interacting with the Force, using specifically crafted items like belts, gloves, and armor to channel and focus their abilities. Their members spent years studying the connections between the Force and the worlds around them. The Jalshe never built a central order. They traveled alone or in small groups, attaching themselves to academies, courts, and diplomatic missions across the Republic. They were scholars first, Force users second, and warriors never. The Taya were a tradition founded by the Revwians, a plant-like species from the Outer Rim world of Revia, who believed the Force was an extension of personal inner peace and avoided violence whenever possible. The Taya taught that every living being carried a personal connection to the Force, which they call by the same name as their tradition. Nurturing that connection through inner calm was the heart of their practice. They named the Force's natural state harmony and its corruption discord, and their goal was to keep the two from falling out of step. When Order 66 wiped out the Jedi, the Taya sent their most capable students into the galaxy to find and aid any survivors. One of the few Force traditions that responded to the Purge with action rather than retreat. And the Tipo Paladins were a group of Jedi censured by the Council for advocating the use of blasters alongside lightsabers. They wore masks and blindfolds in combat to sharpen their connection to the Force, and after being pushed out of the Order, they protected their own communities without the Council's blessing. None of these groups threatened anyone. They did not build empires or start wars. They trained small numbers of followers, served their local communities, and practiced the Force in ways the Jedi Order either didn't know about or didn't consider worth investigating. Their obscurity was their survival strategy, and for most of them, it worked. After the Battle of Endor and the fall of the Empire, a different kind of Force tradition emerged: the cult. The post-Endor era produced a string of dark side movements that lacked the Sith's depth of belief or the cultural roots of the Witches, but made up for it with ambition and desperation. The movements lacked the structure of traditional religions. They were power grabs dressed in Force mysticism, led by individuals who had access to dark side knowledge and the willingness to use it on anyone who would follow them. The Reborn were among the most unsettling. The Jedi vs. Sith reference guide describes how a dark Jedi named Asan used Sith alchemy and Artusian crystals to artificially imbue human Empire youths, young recruits with little or no natural Force sensitivity, with dark side powers. The process worked. The youths gained Force abilities that they had never earned through training or inborn talent. Asan brought them to the Valley of the Jedi on Ruusan, where the leftover Force energy from the Thought Bomb's ancient detonation quadrupled their abilities. However, the Reborn were soldiers, not students. They had raw power and no discipline, and when they faced trained Jedi, the gap in skill was fatal. The barely trained Reborn were no match for opponents who had spent years learning to fight. The disciples of Ragnos followed a similar trajectory. A dark Jedi named Tavian Axmis discovered the Scepter of Ragnos, a Sith artifact capable of draining Force energy from locations strong in the Force and transferring it to individuals or objects. Tavian used the scepter to build an army and attempted to resurrect the ancient Sith Lord, Marka Ragnos. She succeeded briefly. Ragnos' spirit possessed Tavian's body and fought the Jedi Knight Jaden Kor in a confrontation that ended with Kor destroying the scepter and banishing the spirit. The disciples scattered. The Shadow Academy was more organized but equally short-lived. Brachus, a former student of Luke Skywalker's Jedi Academy who had failed to complete his training, founded a mobile battle station designed to train Dark Jedi in bulk. Brachus recruited his initial Force-using students from the Nightsisters of Dathomir, linking the Shadow Academy to one of the oldest dark side traditions in the galaxy. The Academy produced fighters, but not thinkers, and when it was destroyed, the movement died with it. Each of these groups repeated the same mistake the Brotherhood of Darkness had made 1,000 years earlier. They confused numbers with strength. The Reborn had bodies, but did not have training. The Disciples possessed an artifact, but did not develop a doctrine. The Shadow Academy owned a facility, but did not follow a philosophy. All three movements treated the Force as a resource to be mined and distributed, and all of them collapsed the moment they encountered opposition that had dedicated periods of study, learning the difference between having power and knowing how to use it. One post-Endor Sith movement broke the pattern. Darth Krayt, born Asherad Het, was a former Jedi Padawan who survived Order 66 and spent over a century in hiding, studying Sith teachings, rebuilding his body with Yuuzhan Vong biotechnology, and developing a new Sith philosophy he called the Rule of One, where Bane's Rule of Two concentrated power in a single master-apprentice pair. Krayt's Rule of One concentrated authority in a single Sith Lord supported by an entire order of Sith followers. In the Legacy comics, set approximately 130 years after the Battle of Yavin, Krayt's One Sith infiltrated the Imperial Remnant, engineered a war against the Galactic Alliance, and seized control of the galaxy. Krayt sat on the Imperial throne for 7 years before a coalition of Jedi, Imperial loyalists, and Alliance survivors overthrew him. The One Sith outlasted every other post-Endor darkside movement because Krayt had done what Dasan, Tavion, and Brachus had not. He had built an ideology to go with his army. Krayt was killed when the Coalition removed him from power, but he returned. Using darkside techniques drawn from ancient Sith teachings, he resurrected himself and reclaimed control of his order. His second reign ended when Cade Skywalker, a descendant of Luke, killed him again and incinerated his body in a sun to prevent another return. The One Sith survived their founder's death. His followers declared that Krayt's vision would live on through them, and for the first time in Sith history, a Sith Order outlasted the Master who created it. By the era of the Fate of the Jedi novels, roughly 43 to 44 ABY, the galaxy's religious landscape looked nothing like it had on Tython. But the Force kept finding new interpreters. The Jedi Order was still standing. It had been destroyed, rebuilt by Luke Skywalker, and challenged by threats from the Yuuzhan Vong, the Lost Tribe, and the specter of Jacen Solo's fall. The order that existed in 44 ABY was smaller, humbler, and more willing to ask questions than the institution that had governed from Coruscant for 20,000 years. Whether it had learned from its mistakes remained an open question. The Sith persisted in multiple forms. The Rule of Two's lineage ended with Palpatine, but the Lost Tribe was still active in reduced numbers, and the One Sith would rise over a century later. The Bogun kept finding vessels. The Witches of Dathomir carried on. Several witches had trained as Jedi under Luke Skywalker's Reformed Order, and the clan structure on Dathomir continued to produce Force-sensitive women who practiced the old spells. The Nightsisters, diminished but not extinguished, clung to their Book of Shadows. The Baran Do Sages remained on Doran, smaller than they had been before the Jedi started recruiting their children, but practicing openly after Luke Skywalker forced the Hidden Ones back to the surface. The Fallanassi held together on Pydir, practicing the White Current and refusing to use the Force for anything except illusion. The Jensaarai continued on Susefi, forging Cortosa's armor and led by Sarai Kar, who carried the title Keeper of the Truth for an order founded on a lie. The Aing-Tii were still in the Cathal Rift, slowly mending the rift that the Prophet's death had torn open. The Matukai endured, with some of their members choosing to join Luke Skywalker's Jedi Academy and blending their body-centered training into the broader Jedi training program. The Zeison Sha held on from Yanabar, throwing disc blades and carrying a resentment towards the Jedi that their ancestors had never forgiven. The Sorcerers of Tund were gone. The Prophets of the Dark Side were gone. The Doomed were gone. The Reborn, the Disciples, and the Shadow Academy were gone. And the Force was still there, woven through every living thing, studied by some, worshipped by others, weaponized by a few, and understood by no one. After every temple and every tomb, every code and every heresy, it remained exactly what it had been before any of them were born, an energy field, binding the galaxy together, indifferent to every name anyone had ever given it. Quick note before you go, members get early access and a few videos that stay off the main channel. If that's interesting, the link is in the description. Otherwise, here's another video about the 7 levels of Sith you might like.